All right, so again, the purpose of at least the purpose of every Sunday morning for Sunday school, and you could say the sermons also, but specifically in Sunday school, is to spend some time marinating, meditating on whatever it is that we're talking about. And specifically what we're talking about, and we will for a long time, because as usual, every time I go to prepare, I end up, and I think I'm going to get somewhere, I end up being somewhere different, and it's still before where I think I'm going to get. So we're marinating and meditating on the person and work of Jesus, but I'm trying to emphasize the person in the sense of getting to know the person of Jesus. And again, I'll reiterate that every Sunday and multiple times in Sunday school. So what we've talked about the last couple of weeks is this idea of how do you, and I'm emphasizing you, and in your subjective, your personal experience, how do you experience God? And specifically, how do you experience Jesus? And again, that's going to be different for every person. And I hope that you can actually think about that. Like, what does that? Yeah, what does that mean? What is that like? It's funny. On the way in this morning, I was at the office. I had to go back home to pick up the extra kids that we seemed to acquire last night. And it's a Depeche Mode song, but Johnny Cash sang it before he died, and it was he was singing Your Own Person. It's called Personal Jesus, and it's not a Christian song at all. But and it would be interesting to kind of look at kind of the origin of that song, like why did these people write it? But the words are talking about your own personal Jesus, and like this talking to Jesus, and it just was kind of fitting before the Sunday school, and interesting, because if you think about how you experience Jesus, and what does that look like even? Like if somebody were to ask you, a friend or an acquaintance, a family member that isn't necessarily a Christian, if they were to ask you, and this is rhetorical, I don't really want to talk about this, but I just want you to think about it. If they were to ask you, hey, yeah, how would you explain your relationship with Jesus? I mean, what is that like? How does that work? How would you respond to that? I mean, I guess we can have a little conversation about that, but again, I want you to be careful. There's not like a churchy answer. I mean, I guess there could be a church answer to that, but I want you to be careful. If you were to answer that in your own head or say that out loud to yourself in your house, like how you would answer that, I would want you to try to recognize, wow, is this a church answer? Have I ever thought through, hey, what that would sound like to a person that isn't a Christian? So you have a personal relationship with Jesus, that song, personal Jesus, your own personal Jesus. It sounds weird. It's like this little magical thing. It's like this little magic person right here who's Jesus, or is like a Santa Claus. So if you were to really talk about that and really try to work through that, what does that look like? What does a relationship look like with Jesus? And how do you experience him? And kind of the way I'd like to contrast this knowing idea, because I know I've talked about experiencing God, but now I'm just going to switch to, so how do you know Jesus? And again, the difference being knowing about versus knowing. So I want you to just think about that for a second. What's the difference between knowing, because this is, again, something that at least I'm trying to emphasize a lot with what we do here at the church. But there's knowing about, and then there is knowing.
Like relationally?
Yeah. So the difference is you're talking about a relationship. So I can know about George Washington. Why are you laughing?
Because that's what I was thinking.
Really? Holy cow.
That's freaky.
It's kind of weird there. So there's knowing about somebody. And let's keep it with, people. I know about somebody versus I know somebody. Now, in my mind, I kind of, wrote some things that I think help characterize that or make that clear. But how would you explain the difference? I don't know if I'll write it, but I'm going to put Jesus up here. So you can know about Jesus and you can allegedly know Jesus. So what are your thoughts just in kind of using those two things? Yeah, Tracy.
Well, as you're saying, and I do want to clarify that what I'm about to say is not something that I'm dwelling on every single day, every minute and every day. That by you asking your question, how do I experience Jesus? How do I know Jesus? I'm thinking two things. One, he came and lived a life fully subjected to God, unlike the rest of us. And then therefore, in the Hebrews where it says, he intercedes for me, he's praying for me, understanding my weakness as a human being that I can't and won't be fully subjected to God on my own. So I experience him by knowing he empathizes with me and he also lived for me. So that, I don't know if that makes sense, but I say that going, that's not something I sit and think about every day, right? I'm thinking about it right now because you're asking me that question, but that's kind of how. So knowing about is just, everybody's heard in a historical time frame, Jesus did exist. I think most people accept that, right?
Okay.
But then knowing
So,
him.
but knowing him.
I was going to say, is the other two things I just said.
Okay, so you just use grammar, whether you know that or not, to make a point that you haven't blatantly made yet.
Okay.
But do you know what the difference was in your grammar?
No.
Did anybody else catch the difference? Okay, so knowing about, so she said Jesus lived. So he lived a life of subjection to God. So he lived, so that's past tense.
Oh, yeah.
That's information about.
Yeah, because I said historically.
Yeah, historically. So there, and I'm not trying to say, these are just making two distinctions, okay? So don't read into distinctions. Now I am trying to show, what's the difference with knowing now? So Jesus lived, you use that in past tense, but then you use some other verbs in what tense?
Present. He's interceding.
In the present tense, meaning, so there's a presupposition or a belief of what regarding Jesus? Change that to present.
Jesus is living.
Yeah, Jesus lives. He's living. You said intercede. You said empathize. He empathizes. So that's not just he empathized or he interceded, because like you said, most people would acknowledge that there was this person that lived. And often people who aren't Christian, and even the people who are Christian, use the information about to say, hey, this is the kind of man Jesus was, this is what he did, so therefore, he's an example to be emulated, or he's a person to be honored because of what he was or what he did. And that's knowing about. But this idea of knowing, there is a presupposition or a belief that, hey, he didn't just live in the past. He didn't just do this stuff in the past. Hey, I believe that he's still living. He's still interceding. He's still empathizing. He's still covering all of those things, okay? Any other distinction about... what other distinction would you say? You just, I brought that out just in the language you're using. So knowing about versus knowing. I mean, how would you think about that in light of regular interaction? like with people. Again, relationship. Think about it in terms of relationship. How would you explain or describe the difference there? Knowing about is really easy. I mean, that's really easy to explain, right?
Yeah, you just throw data out.
I throw information out. I throw data. Greg is a white male,
Nice looking young man.
50-something. He has a beard. So I can know about Greg, but not know him. So think about it in terms of that. So what's the difference with knowing somebody?
Well, even when you say that, like you just described what he looks like if we were to see him, but we don't know his motives. We don't know what motives, like what drives him, what's important to him. When you say he's a white male and he's got whatever you just said.
Okay. Yeah, I would say yes. And even as you described that, I would still say it's driving at information.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I want to know more about him. What are his motives? What drives? That's still like information you're about. I mean, listen, I've never thought through this until I did this right here. So think about knowing somebody. How is that different than information? Or how would you explain that? Yeah, Greg.
So as Tracy was talking, and this verse came to mind where I think it was Paul says, people answer Paul and they say, yeah, we believe in God. And he says, well, you do well. The demons believe and tremble. So this...
Okay, hold on. Did you hear what he just said at the end?
Mm-hmm.
What did he say?
Demons believe
The demons believe and tremble. Remember, and tremble, as it's related to knowing right now. So go ahead.
Data doesn't really impact my life. You know what I mean? In other words, it doesn't necessarily change my experience of life. And in Paul, he said, the demons believe to the point where it actually impacts their life. And what I hear Tracy saying is that I experience, there's a difference between data that affects knowledge and a relationship that impacts my experience of life.
Okay, you guys get that? I mean, did you hear what he said? It impacts my life. Now, information can still impact my life, okay? So, it can still impact my life. I could want to emulate some. I mean, it could drive behavior in a sense. I was even thinking emotionally. Is there a difference between these? And I think you can draw an emotional impact. You can still have some of that with information.
And it's a different kind.
And it's a different kind. But what kind of excites me now, even as I'm drawing this out, I'd like to take credit for.
You're the guy with the pencil.
This knowing, this relationship piece, it's different in how it impacts your life. And how, like this, the demons believe and tremble. I thought about this even in terms of, we had the Hoffers and the Pierces over last night for the Final Four. And I thought, again, in thinking about the difference here as far as knowing about and knowing, I do know about the Hoffers and the Pierces. I can name their names. I can name their different characteristics. I can even tell you how different people like Anne impact my life. I picked her because she's smiling at me right there by the pillow, trying to hide behind the pillow. Anne and I have a relationship kind of like Snowflake, my cat. Yours is more positive, Anne, okay? You bring a smile to my face, whereas usually I'm a little bit angry at Snowflake. That's an insight kind of a thing. But I can know about the people. I can know about my son Caleb and Reagan, and I can name off things about and how that impacts my life, how they impact my life. But when I'm faced with being face to face with them, so I thought about this in light of when you guys come to my house, there's a different impact. There's a different impact. There's a different result in my life relationally. It spurs emotion. It spurs different things, and that can be different at different times. Okay, but the actual relationship, the actual interaction with the people, is a different knowing than knowing about. Okay, you guys following me? Yeah.
Well, because we're experiencing things together. So we experienced, some of you were more happy than I was, but Auburn lost. But we experienced that game together, right? And with Jesus interceding for me, us empathizing, he's experiencing life with me, and I'm experiencing his. Do you see what I'm saying? Information is just information, and like you said, so we tend to take the information, now I'm going to go, try to emulate that by myself. But I'm not experiencing with that person, what you're describing even. And that's how we know Jesus, is we are experiencing him.
Yes,
Okay.
Sharing them
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
It's yours and theirs.
Yeah.
We need together.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what are the thoughts about this kind of distinction between knowing about and knowing? And, like, relationally, what is that? You get the thought, Rick? Or a couple of them?
I had one.
I can come back to you. Do you want to wait?
Well, it's something about there's a trend, that's kind of not a happy word in fundamentalism. There's this transaction that occurs with people that you don't get with data. It's kind of like you sort data, or you apply data, or you use data, and that's how it impacts you. But there's this transaction that occurs in relationship just with setting with somebody.
Okay, so you said transaction, and I would agree with that. The only thing I thought of when you said that was kind of like what you said too, Tracy, that I don't know how to explain that. Transaction kind of implies that there's this interaction that takes place, and then there's an outcome as a result of that interaction. I would argue, this is fascinating to me just as I've thought through the difference here. I would argue that as soon as you walk in the room, whether there's words or not, there's something that happens relationally. There's things that are happening relationally. And it's an interaction without even words. Both on the beneficial side and not so much, depending on moods and whatever, all kinds of stuff, depending on words that are said or interaction on a face. There is something that happens that's different than information about when Jeff walks in the room and he and I make eye contact. Or we don't have to make eye contact. I can see Jeff, he doesn't even know I'm in the room. Something happens there's things that are happening. And I hear a lot, I see a lot of nodding of heads. What are you guys hearing there? Or what are you agreeing with? Yeah.
Well, to me, as I've talked to you before, when you talk to most people, it's just kind of words like you're just talking to the top crust. But when you really get to know somebody and communicate underneath that, in my mind, to me, it's always digging underneath the crust and seeing what's there, how they're feeling, what they're thinking. So with the Lord, he knows everything that I think, whether I want him to or not. He does. And he interacts with me on a feeling, emotional basis that's underneath all the nice talk that you just generally do with people.
Okay. Yeah, Tracy.
Well, I'm thinking, when you're asking why I'm nodding, because every person has a dynamic. And Jill, I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis, who talked about the four loves, or the different friendships. And when people get together, like one of their friends dies, so it was a group of guys that always got together, and one of the guys died, and he was no longer a part of their group. And the whole dynamic of the group was different, because that particular person's dynamic
for some reason I thought, yeah, and that dynamic is they're either taking from my life or they're giving me life. Now those are two extremes, but try to analyze that when you walk into a room of people, or before even talking to a person, try to observe what is going on in you emotionally and everything else. That is this that's this thing that's going on. Sorry, that's why I'm laughing. But you're talking about a dynamic that each person brings that has everything to do with this idea of knowing, or the relationship piece. Okay? Yeah.
I don't know if I can explain this clearly, but along with what Tracy's saying, I think he said something to the effect of, like, St. Bob was the guy's name, or whatever, that passed away, and he brought out certain personality characteristics in this other guy, Bill, for example, or I don't know. But so just we bring certain aspects out of each other. Like, different people have a way of doing. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well,
But I think
again,
that's kind of an interesting thing too. I don't know. just
and that's
thinking
much
about-
different than just knowing about the information. I can look at information about George Washington, but it's not necessarily bringing out some dynamic of my personality that has to do with this relationship. Because that has everything to do with your relationship with that person. Bill's relationship with
And
Bob.
how they're different, right? But yet how there's some connection that they have that's unique.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, anything else? I said, again, nodding heads when I was talking about this distinction between, as far as knowing, the dynamic. Well, go ahead. Go ahead, young lady.
He was making the point that he'll never, or he won't, maybe not never, but he will unlikely experience that aspect of Bill anymore because Bob isn't bringing that out anymore. Does that make even that? I thought was an interesting point. So sorry.
Okay. Okay, so anything else before we transition again to something else? What, Jeff?
You're reading my mind. Is that yes?
That's it. Hey, I just
Yeah.
exemplified this.
Maybe this is a softball lob for you. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to give it to you right
Okay,
now.
thank you.
This is what I'm doing.
I'll determine that.
From my perspective, that's what I'm doing. That's my truth.
Your truth.
Anyway, with Jesus, because what you said earlier, the mystical, magical, lucky rabbit's foot kind of version of Jesus. I think when we were in India on that mission trip, people would have on their dashboard of their car a little figurine of their god or goddess or whatever, and that was their good luck charm. And we do in our culture, in a lot of ways, kind of treat Jesus like that. We've got Jesus shirts and bumper stickers and big goose fishes on people's cars and everything else. So all that we've said about knowing people, which we can all relate to, and just makes sense to all of us. But there's this huge distinction in that we don't experience Jesus with our five senses in the same way as a human being we can see and touch and talk to, and you know what I mean? So I'm still eager to, how do we connect what we mean by experiencing Jesus with people? You know what I mean? How do we communicate that when we don't see him, we don't hear him, it's kind of one way. Like we pray and we read about, but he's not sitting here. You know what I mean?
Well, and part of, or one of the outcomes that would be great as a result of this study, and this could last till next fall. I mean, who knows? But is just that. I want you to struggle with, or hopefully you're thinking through, what does it mean to personally know Jesus? And how do I explain that to a person if they ask me that? And that's not just like a sales pitch thing that I want us to try to come up with. I want you to personally go, hey, this is what it means to me. This is what this is like. And I think any way you look at it, it's weird. And I say it's weird because it is. I mean, the Bible tells us that it's foolishness to people out there that don't believe in Jesus, okay? It looks like, it does seem like a magical, mystical little thing over here that, depending on how you explain it, isn't a whole lot different than a whole lot of other gods out there. Now, Jesus is completely different than all the other made-up gods out there. But what I'm saying is, hey, listen to how you explain it. Listen to how you treat Jesus. So anyway, knowing about versus knowing. Jesus lived, that's knowing about. Jesus lives, okay? So now how do I, and especially since we don't experience him in the same way, now I want to be careful because, as we go through this, hey, you could say, is it possible to experience Him in a similar way as we do other people? That's part of why I want to look at just the normal human aspect of Jesus and when He lived, and then how we experience Him now. I mean, what is that like? Because typically, at least from my experience and my point of view, we've left Jesus in this category. Hey, it's information about Him. And it's fantastic information. And it does have impacts. But hey, what happens if we connect the dot over here? Can we connect it? Now, and I think we can. So I do. Do you have something,
I
Jeff?
was going to say, maybe that's what, so we try to explore what that means today, in light of the fact that we don't see Him and don't experience Him with our natural senses. Maybe that's what points us back to what is the information? How does that information help flesh out for us who He really is, and even compel us in ways different from a lucky rabbit's foot or a figurine of a certain goddess on someone's dashboard for good luck? You know what I mean? Like, that does help. I don't know. I'll leave there. But
Yes, and that's why I wasn't trying to draw a distinction like good or bad between information, between these two things, knowing about versus knowing. But yeah, I want to take it from, for some reason you made me think of, the funny sports videos, where, somebody scores a touchdown or something, and the guy's in front of the camera saying, I want to thank Jesus Christ, my personal Lord and Savior for,
Yeah.
And look, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just, that can lend to this tendency of that he was a lucky rabbit's foot, okay? The funny distinction last night that you can look at the wars throughout history and the wars of the battle that takes place between two basketball teams. You got two coaches that are both praying to allegedly the same God, and they both have wives that are in the stand holding their little, Mark Few is a Catholic, and Mike Krzyzewski is a Catholic. I've seen him do his thing before every game. He pulls out his little thing. They're praying to the same God. They're asking the same God for the same thing. Okay, and one's going to lose and the other's going to win. Okay, so how do we take God from just how do you treat God? And I want you to be able to recognize that, or not how you treat Him, but how do you experience Him? How do you know Him, especially as we're talking about Jesus? Yeah, great.
When Jeff said, it created some thoughts in my mind in reference to, I think of things like aloneness and loneliness, and if you have friends, they don't have to be there, but you don't feel alone because you know you have friends that aren't there, right? And I think, and then it reaches a point in your life where that doesn't answer your need, and yet you experience Jesus in such a way that you still don't feel alone. So in some ways we do experience Him like we experience people that are right there in front of us.
No, I would agree with that.
And I think he agrees with that too. And this is not a slap at him.
That's where Jeff is wrong. Let's just say it.
I think he might be confused. But, no,
That's
and
it.
I don't. But it made me think about, here's what Jeff did for me. It made me think about, is my experience of Jesus like my experience of others?
Yeah. So,
and in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't.
right. So I think the thing that you're talking about is Jeff said we don't experience Jesus with the five senses the same way we do with other people. Well, we actually do in some cases with the senses, okay? But now, what is that like? So, and that's, as we go through this, how do we experience Jesus in the same way as a relationship with another person? That's what all my life growing up in the church, the idea of a relationship with God, or a relationship with Jesus, just always sounded weird to me. Because it's invisible, it's not like another person right here. It sounds weird when you talk about it. How do you explain it? But I've never really thought about it in detail like I hope for us to go through, to try to clarify some of that to where it makes sense. So anyway, let's any other things, any other thing regarding the relationship piece or...
Real quick,
Yeah.
difference between relationship with Jesus and relationship with other people is relationship with people you judge and are judged. A relationship with Jesus, you don't judge, you're not judged.
Okay, so we'll hit some of that when we talk about the impact. So I was kind of intrigued, and I haven't fleshed it out totally. I am intrigued by this idea of knowing in relationship and the results that come from knowing. So I didn't even think about that. So that this idea that, Scripture says, hey, look, you say you believe. Well, the demons believe and they tremble. So there's an impact to their belief. I mean, there's an impact to their knowing. Okay, that hopefully we'll have a couple of those come out here in the passages that I want to go through. So I just want to run through a few passages, kind of mixed in these verses are a combination of both of these. I just kind of want to make some observations about some of these verses. So, and again, here, let's just go through it. So John 21:25. This is the end of the book of the Gospel of John, where, again, the Gospel is a book about Jesus. It chronicles his life. And John writes, there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. So what do you hear? Just to make some observations about that verse alone. What's obvious?
Well, the knowledge about Jesus is, what's the word?
Vast.
It's a lot of information about him.
Okay, so information about all the things that he did. And he's talking about what kind of things?
Will he heal?
Yeah, so miraculous things. Things that are very different from another person. Okay, so John, hit the highlights of what he did. What's interesting to me, too, like I told you last week, when you look at the beginning of Matthew for sure, I can't remember now, I didn't look at it this week, but I think Mark also. Matthew, right up front, immediately, right after the birth of Jesus, and then John the Baptist, preparing the way for the Messiah, and then right as he begins to go into the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the first thing he lists is he went to every town, in every place, and he healed every disease and sickness. And so it's just a brief summary where, hey, Jesus went and he healed everybody. Wherever he went, he healed people everywhere. Okay, so this idea that, hey, look at what he did. So this is stuff about Jesus. So look at what he did. John says, hey, I just wrote a little bit here. If everything that was recorded, and is this a little exaggeration?
We know very little.
We know very little. Would the whole world be filled literally? Maybe not, but he's making a point here that, hey, Jesus did so much more than we captured, that I captured right here in this little historical account, that there would just be volumes and volumes and volumes. And what just struck me even as I said that out loud is what would be really interesting, and maybe in heaven, we'll see this, and maybe you won't even think it's interesting right now, but if you think about each life that was touched by Jesus in that little account. So whether it was healing a blind child, think about the impact of that person and the little, or whether that was just in a brief 2-minute or 5-minute encounter with Jesus, or if it was repeated encounters over the course of a life, what was the impact to that life, relationally, and everything else? Okay, so anyway, so there's that one. If they were written in detail, so that's interesting there. If they were written in detail, it wasn't just Jesus healed this blind person, but gosh, look at the impact to that life, to the family life, to whatever that detail would be. That's what I think of when I think of detail. Colossians 2, verses 2 through 3. And I will send you, I'll get you guys this, I've got this all laid out in a Word document. Paul says that they may be encouraged in heart, knit together in love, and filled with the full riches of complete understanding, so that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So again, pointing to Christ, talking about knowing Christ. And how would you explain maybe the difference in this verse between knowing about versus knowing? When Paul is saying, and that you would know the mystery of God, which is specifically Christ, and he says, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Jeff?
I was going to say, I guess whenever in our lives we encounter anything that really is wisdom or really is knowledge, we are encountering Christ in that moment. We know we don't see him, we don't hear him, but you may hear that from anybody. A professor at school is talking about biology or something, and they're speaking truth about what is biological reality. There's no acknowledgement of it in the moment probably, but you're hearing truth, which really comes from Christ, who is the Creator, according to Colossians. And just to color this a little bit more, in this conversation, Jill and I talked, Tracy, whatever, a weeks ago, I guess, and talked about how, if what it says in Colossians about Christ, everything is held together in Christ, then anytime we eat breakfast, drink coffee, speak with someone, everything we experience, he is in and behind in a sense. You know what I mean? So that's mind-blowing, but that's what Revelation is telling us. So that's an interesting way to look at it too. It's like he's not here, and yet he's everywhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah, which is interesting, I think can be really helpful when I talk about like personally experiencing God on a daily basis. There's information that drives personally experiencing God. And that when I'm sitting here eating coffee, hey, I believe that one, he's alive, and two, he's the creator that's holding everything together right now as I'm drinking this coffee. Okay? That's going to give me, and of course we can just, flesh that out more and more as far as, hey, I won't right now, but that's where the awareness of that, the purposeful thinking of that is, hey, wait a minute, God is intimately involved every second of my life right now. Whether I understand that or not, or whether and then what does that impact? How does that impact you? What does that result in you? David.
I love that. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. It's popping in my head right there, where it's beyond just the information, but he's here in every moment. And I was kind of experiencing that with facing some discomfort recently, and it was coming back around to what we've been talking about here. This is all for a good purpose, and kind of having this wrestling match. It's not good, but then the thought, the truth, come back to where no, this is discomfort for you right now. Go forward to discomfort is good for you. So I took that as the truth. So that must be him.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, here's another one from Colossians. Colossians 2, verses 8 through 10. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, which are based on human tradition and the spiritual forces of the world rather than on Christ. For in Christ all the fullness of the deity dwells in bodily form. So kind of that touches on what Jeff was talking about, that, hey, he holds together life itself. Well, this verse says, hey, in Jesus, the full deity of God dwelt in Jesus when he was here on earth, okay? Any thoughts regarding that verse? I want to try to hit most of these other verses. Okay, here's another one like it. Hebrews 1:3. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature, upholding all things by his powerful word. So the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature. Now Now again, to me, well, what can be, I mean, from a human perspective, profoundly confusing about that statement right there? Any idea? How about this question? Especially in the Gospels, when glory is used, what is it specifically pointing to as it pertained to Jesus? When Jesus talked about him being glorified and the God being glorified in him, what is he pointing to?
The cross.
The cross! Do you understand why I said, how is that profoundly confusing? I mean, just from a normal human perspective.
That God would experience death. Is that what you're?
No, well, I'm specifically saying that the glorification of Jesus and the glory that I think even Hebrews is talking about right here is specifically pointing to the cross. That the glory of God seen in and through Christ is specifically seen at the cross. Again, to me, this blows my mind because this to me proves that there's a God. Because that is not a human concept, okay? That the most powerful God, the creator of the universe, the one that is holding everything together, but by his word, decided to make himself known by being put to death on a cross. He decided to make himself known through his mercy, and the mercy being the forgiveness, the redemption, the life that he was going to provide through his death on the cross. And not just his death on the cross, but his willingness, his voluntarily, like we said last week in 2 Corinthians 5:20, that he literally became sin. So he took the sin of his creatures, and he became that sin, and he took it to put it to death on the cross, so that we could become the righteousness of God in Christ. So that's mind-blowing. I mean, yeah, Tracy.
What's cool is we're talking about knowing Jesus, experiencing Jesus. He experienced death. He didn't just have an information or knowledge about it. He experienced it for us. Like that's the God of the universe who holds all things together. And not just that moment on the cross, but has even walked up to it and was spit upon and beaten and ridiculed. He experienced all of that. When you think about that whole relational aspect, it's super cool.
And I would argue, at least for me, this idea of knowing. So how do I know Jesus? How am I experiencing him on a daily basis? Well, every time I get I don't know why I thought of this word, but I get a whiff of my own sin. I get a taste of my own depravity. It reminds me of the glory of God in Christ on the cross. So I experience Christ. I mean, I know, you tell me if that sounds weird, but I'm experiencing Jesus in that moment in which I am experiencing my own sin. Does that make sense? David, Jeff, go ahead.
Take the Hebrews verse you read earlier about being the radiance of God's glory, and that word, radiate, you think like a radiator takes the heat from the heating element and distributes it to the people who need it, right? It takes it from one place to another, distributes it, moves it. Sort of think of God radiating his glory to us through the person and work of Jesus. The moment of most clear reception of that, or awareness and experience of that, is in what you're describing with the sin, and it just meets us in that place of need. Right?
That's exactly right. So the place of need, and that's where kids, and then this is where Jesus only remains a rabbit. Does anybody even carry around rabbit's feet anymore? I just say that because I remember in high school, everybody had a rabbit's foot. Snowflake had a rabbit's foot this morning. Sorry, inside statement. And so even as I say rabbit's foot, I mean, kids, do you know what a rabbit's foot is? So a rabbit's foot is, people used to carry around a rabbit's foot on like a cheat cane. How gross is that, okay? And it's a good luck charm. Don't ask me what it's some Greek god thing. I don't know what that is. I'll have to look at what the historical background of the rabbit's foot is. It's fingernails. I mean, where's PETA in light of rabbit's feet? That's why we don't have them anymore. So kids, a rabbit's foot was a good luck charm, okay? So whatever people use for good luck charms now, I don't know what it is. It's not rabbit's feet anymore. Jesus only remains a good luck charm for you until you recognize your need for help. And what I mean specifically by that is that I'm tired of being the king of my life, and I'm tired of my own sin. And I recognize and believe that I am a sinner. I'm a person, and when I say sinner, that means, kids, that if it were up to me, I would fight God right here and right now. And if it were up to me, I would beat him down and take his place. And that's the way I act every day, as far as I want to be the king and the God of my own life. So until you recognize that, or until you really believe that, and you go, wow, that's the human dynamic. That's the human DNA. That's why I need help, because that's a burden that I cannot bear. And until you get to the point in your life, whether it's young or older, to where you say, this is a burden that's too heavy for me, I'm tired of being the king of my own life, and I want and need the help of Jesus, who took this sin to the cross, Jesus is only going to remain a rabbit's foot magician to you. And look, have I prayed to God that he helps me hit these free throws in a game? Yes, I have. Do I think he still cares? Yeah, I do. Does he help me when I miss those free throws? Yes. But in a sense, that's kind of using God as a rabbit's foot. I mean, if I just keep it there. If I keep it there and never realize that the help that God is willing to provide goes way beyond the free throw line or this basketball game. Now, here's the thing. He empathizes with me in that moment, and he knows where I'm at in that moment, and he's offering way more than that moment. Okay, so, yeah, Tracy.
Because you just did an awesome picture. You said that weight of carrying the burden on my back to be my own king. And Jesus says, come to me, all who are weak and heavy laden, and I will give rest.
So, I got to read, because this is one of the verses, okay? And I want to finish that on the impacts. Okay, so the impacts of knowing Jesus, the impacts of experiencing him right here and now, it's one of the impacts right here. So I just read Hebrews 1. So somebody already said this in Hebrews, never will I leave you nor forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? I'll probably save that to expand that a little bit more. But that is incredible. That's, again, this idea of that I need help. And in this dynamic in the human experience, what can humans do to me? What can man do to me? I mean, to me, the human experience there, like you just kind of said, David, I don't know what the struggle that you were referring to, but especially as we go into the conflict workshop, Jeff, hey, that's profound in the human experience. Is that, hey, what am I trying to get here in this human relationship, in this human experience, and what is happening, and the struggle that's going on between kings and queens here in this world. And here the writer of Hebrews is saying, hey, never will I leave you nor forsake you. And so we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? We'll have to save that for another time. So here, listen, what is the impact here, or the result of the relationship and knowing Jesus in this verse right here? So this is John again. If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Truly, truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. A slave is not a permanent member of the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So, I mean, when I say impact, the impact of this knowing, sure, it involves knowing about. But this impact, as far as knowing, what is one of the impacts that John is talking about right here? freedom. And especially as we talk about that burden, hey, this freedom now to me has everything. It's logical, it's rational. I know what that means to me right now, every single day, every single minute. It isn't just some bizarre, magical concept that God's going to set me free at some point in time. Or I'm going to be free from this baggage when I finally die. No. When I experience the weight of my sin and my willingness to carry or try to control my own world through my kingship, then I remember, hey, Jesus came to set me free from that, and I can look to Him as the real King. So the impact, freedom. Then, of course, that's when I included, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not be encumbered once more by a yoke of slavery. And again, that yoke of slavery being my sin or my addiction to myself, my kingship, my control, my whatever you want to say. For you, brothers, were called to freedom, but do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Rather, serve one another. And Matthew, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And I want to expand on that as far as that the impact, again, the impact of real knowing, not just knowing about, but knowing Jesus and my experience of Him right now. How does it provide that outcome or that impact as far as knowing Him now? You guys understand what I'm saying by that? I mean, I guess I'm saying it in the phrase of a question, but I'm making the point that that's what this knowing does. That's what me experiencing Jesus in my subjective experience today provides and can provide that rest and that freedom as a result of knowing Him in this moment. We have to stop. Any other thoughts you guys want to make, or any like really important ideas that just smacked you upside the head as I was talking right there? I didn't impact. Oh, good.
I think it's interesting. Your first scripture allusion was to this. At least you talk about a child that's healed by Jesus. Well, there's a data pack, a little packet of data, right? But then you opened it up and said, what did that roll into as far as life and his life and the people's life around this child and the difference in his life? And that's huge. That's to say, oh yeah, all that was in that little data pack that I heard you say. And then it opened up into something much more. And all of those verses are little data packs that are foolishness to man, and their spirit and life to us. If they become more than a little data.
That's right. And I'll close with this verse that kind of, I'm glad you said that because I wasn't going to read this verse. But Paul says, but whatever, I wrote the wrong wording here. Whatever was gain to me, I count as loss for the sake of Christ. More than that, I count all things as loss compared to the surpassing excellence of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ and be found in Him, not having my own righteousness from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God on the basis of faith. And you guys know this. He says, I want to know Christ in the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings, being conformed to Him in His death, and to somehow attain to the resurrection from the dead. And this is a guy who once elevated his knowledge of stuff, his knowledge of God, as of utmost importance. And now he's saying, I count all of that as rubbish. And he says, I want to know Christ. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. I mean, even saying, and the power, tells me that it's this living, breathing thing. It's not just a piece of data or knowledge. It is something that is in the living being of Jesus Christ.